Ecosystems, a smart board unit for grade 4. By the end of this unit, students will be able to construct and explain the elements of a simple food chain and construct and explain the elements of food waste. First, what is ecology? Ecology is the study of the interactions between organisms and their environment. What is an ecosystem? Students' responses: I think an ecosystem is habitat, living things, and other responses. Let's watch a short movie about biotic ecosystem components.
When we think of nature, we usually think of living things such as plants and animals. The biotic components of an ecosystem include all the living things in an area. This is a monarch butterfly, and this is a tiger swallowtail butterfly. You decide. Why are these butterflies different from each other? These butterflies are members of two different species. A species consists of a group of organisms which can successfully reproduce among themselves. Members of the same species possess similar characteristics. They often appear and behave similarly, like these Canada geese. A group of the same species in the same area is called a population. For example, the water lilies in this pond make up a water lily population, and the geese in this field make up a population, as do the turtles in this pond. Rarely in nature is a single population of organisms the only population in a place. For example, in this wetland located in the Florida Everglades, there are populations of alligators, anhingas, fish, and water lilies, to name just a few. All these different populations of living things make up a community. A community consists of all the living organisms in an area. Ecologists often categorize areas by natural communities. A natural community consists of all of the plants and animals interacting with their environment. The definition of a natural community is similar to that of an ecosystem, but the size of an ecosystem is variable, from as small as a tidal pool to as large as an entire mountain range. Ecologists tend to refer to natural communities in more localized areas, such as hillsides, swamps, or forests. For example, this community is referred to as a hemlock forest. It's called that because hemlocks are the dominant tree, although many other plants and animals are found here.
In every ecosystem, there are living organisms and non-living organisms. Living organisms are things like plants, animals, and decomposers, and non-living organisms are the sun, the soil, water, air, rocks, and sand. Now let's sort these different organisms into living and non-living. That's right. Good. Students can come up and to the board and sort these different organisms to where they think they go, thereby getting an idea of the difference between a living thing and a non-living thing. What is a herbivore? A herbivore is a plant-consuming consumer. Here are some examples of herbivores: squirrel, the horse, mouse. What is an omnivore? Well, an omnivore is a consumer that eats both plants and animals. Here are some examples: a box turtle, a badger, the eastern bluebird. What is a carnivore? A carnivore is a meat-eating consumer. Here are some examples: an owl, a hawk, the wolf. Now the students can identify herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Sort these pictures into their different categories. Students can sort these and therefore showing the difference and what they know about these different types. Let's practice. Decide if this is an example of a herbivore, a carnivore, or an omnivore. Oops, try again. That's right, good job. It's an omnivore. Try this one, the Venus flytrap. That's right, good job. This plant eats meat. One more time, the squirrel. I think it's a herbivore. That's right, good job. Now that we know the different types of organisms and consumers, let's talk about what is a food chain. A food chain is the path of energy transfer from one organism to another. Plants are often the first link in a food chain. Plants convert energy from the sun into a usable form that can be passed on to other organisms. Plants are called producers. Organisms that eat producers are called consumers. Consumers, such as a fox, eat other consumers, such as a pheasant. Now let's take a look at this food chain video to learn a little bit more about food chains.
A nuclear reaction happens deep inside the sun, where hydrogen atoms are fused into helium. Then their heat and light is radiated into space, and 90 million miles it shines upon the Earth's face. For every 100 calories that shines from the sun, the calories are green plus triple number only one. But every single calorie in ocean, hills, and plains will serve as a foundation for a living food chain. At the bottom of the food chain are producers like in plants, whose cells make food from sunlight, making use of chloroplasts. It happens in the pines and flowers on your windowsill, cause every single grain plant's got a little chlorophyll. Well, the next bit of food chain is a primary consumer, an herbivore, a cow, or vegetarian baby boomer. The primary consumer spends its mealtime eating plants. It might be a buffalo or it might be an ant. Each level in a food chain yields only 10%. The former level's energy, you might as well. There are bones and leaves you can't digest that really make it then. And don't ignore the weight it costs to metabolic grams. So if your plants are yielding about 100 calories, your yield would only be 10 in the birdies and the bees. 700 calories in algae in the sea. Primary consumers, it will yield you 70. Some other ways of getting food are really out of sight. You can be a predator or be a parasite. Predator eats meat, a parasite eats your insides. And if you're a decomposer, you will leave me when I die. And if you know this about food chains, you can really take the cake. When energy goes through, it doesn't last, it dissipates. Nutrients in food chains meet a very different fate. They recycle and they circulate forever, ain't that great? Just remember there's no beings in this world that live alone. Populations form communities where all to make their home. Though your niche may be determined in the role that you are playing, every creature alive or dead is in the food chain.
Well, where does the energy come from? All of the organisms living in a community depend on one another for survival. The energy is passed from one organism to another. The energy all begins with the sun. Producers, consumers, and decomposers. Producers are organisms that use the sun's energy to make their own food. Green plants are producers. Consumers are organisms that get energy from eating producers or other consumers. Deer are consumers. Decomposers are organisms that consume dead plants and animals. Bacteria and mushrooms are decomposers. Describe the roles in the ecosystem of these different organisms. Well, producers make own food. And the consumers eat plants and animals. The decomposers, they eat dead things. There are three, here's a little more about consumers. There are three main types of consumers. The herbivores, these are animals that eat only plants. The carnivores are animals that eat only meat. And the omnivores are animals that eat both plants and animals. Let's see what you remember about the three kinds of consumers. What's a herbivore? Animals that eat only plants. What's a carnivore? Animals that eat other animals. And what's an omnivore? Animals that eat plants and animals. In an ecosystem, there is a predator-prey relationship. The predator is an animal that hunts other animals, and the prey is the animal that the predator catches. This is a food chain. The food chain always starts with the sun's energy. Next are the plants, which are the producers. Next are primary consumers, or the herbivores, and last are the secondary consumers, or carnivores. Food chains follow a single path as animals eat each other. Grass is eaten by a grasshopper, the grasshopper is eaten by a frog, the frog is eaten by a snake, the snake is eaten by a hawk. Create a food chain. Move the items around to create 3 separate food chains, then draw an arrow to show the movement of the energy through the food chain. Okay, we'll start with the sun. Grass. The rabbit. The snake. The fox. Then we'll draw an arrow to show the flow of energy. Continue for the other two. Here's a simulation showing the food chain of a country garden. Primary consumer eats the producer. Secondary consumer eats the primary consumer. Tertiary consumer eats the secondary consumer. Energy is lost at each level, so the final consumer needs to eat a lot more to get the energy it needs. Select one of the ecosystems above and complete the food chain yourself. Start here. Grass, rabbit, weasel, fox. Energy flows in this direction. Here's an example of a food chain. Notice the arrows are used to show the direction of the transfer of energy. Create a food chain with these words and arrows. Energy. Primary producer. Primary consumer. Secondary consumer. Decomposer. Scavenger. Predator. Prey. Herbivore. And there we have the flow of energy in the food chain. Try this food chain puzzle. The soil provides food for the blank, which provides food for the bird. Worm, Finally, let's explore food webs. What is a food web? A food web is a group of interconnected food chains. What does a food web look like? Here's an example of a food web. You see many different food chains, how they are all interconnected. Here's a link to a Bill Nye song about food webs.
Well, take a look at my plate. It's a sight, cause it's piled with food. While I'm looking it over, and it looks so good. Cause I got milk, I got meat, I got pasta and bread. I got chicken and egg rolls, and processed cheese spread. I got ice cream, I got whipped cream, I got tacos, I got fish. But none of it seems like a vegetable dish. But the truth of the matter of this food situation is that all of these things get their start with vegetation. It's the food web. It's the food web. You see, meat has to eat, and noodles need wheat. Yeah, we need plants for the things that we eat. Cause sugar needs cane, and honey needs bees that get pollen from the flowers in the fields and the trees. But maybe now you're asking, hey, what's a plant need? They gotta come from something, yeah, you know they gotta feed. Well, a plant needs water, and a plant needs sun. Dirt, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. It's the food web. It's the food web.
Now, circle the food web. That's right. This other picture is a food chain. What will happen to the food web if the owls are removed? If we remove the owls, the rabbits, squirrels, and mice would not have would become too plentiful. What if the toads were removed? If the toads were removed, then snakes would not have one of their food sources, and the predaceous insects would become too plentiful. What if the mice were removed? If the mice were removed, the foxes, hawks and owls, snakes would not have one of their food sources and would have trouble having enough to eat. Food webs show many animals are interconnected by different paths. 1. Trees make acorns, which are eaten by mice and insects. 2. Because there are many mice and insects, weasels, snakes, and raccoons have food. 3. Also, insects attract birds, skunks, and possums. And 4. When the birds, skunks, mice, and possums are around, hawks, foxes, and owls can find food. They are all connected. Create a food web. Draw arrows to show the relationship between the animals of this ecosystem. Mice eat the grass, so do the rabbits and the birds. Birds eat the snakes. This needs to go the other way around. Here's another food web. Look at the animals in this ecosystem. Question 1. What would happen if someone removed all of the foxes in the pond ecosystem? What animals would decrease in number first? Well, without the fox, the rabbits would increase in number greatly, as there'd be no predator for them. Question 2. What would happen if there were no more dragonflies at the pond? What animals would decrease at the pond? Well, if there was no more dragonflies, then the frogs would be affected, as their food source would not be available. So would the turtles. And losing these, the frogs and turtles not being available, would mean there'd be less food for the foxes. So lots of different animals would be affected. Question 3. What would happen if there was a drought and all the pot water dried up? What animal would be affected first? If the water dried up, then the water animals, like these water insects and frogs and turtles, they would be affected first, as their habitat would not be available. But the other animals would be affected by the loss of these animals as well. And that's the end of this unit, this smartboard unit on ecosystems.